In 1849, a single egg in San Francisco cost the equivalent of $30 today. A pound of flour ran 6 times the price back east. Men who crossed half a continent chasing gold discovered something cruel when they arrived. The real fortune was not in the river. It was in the food. Number 18 on this list was so hated that miners rioted over it. Actual riots. And number 7 saved more lives than any doctor in California territory. These were not meals. They were survival tactics disguised as supper, eaten by men who worked 18-hour days, standing knee-deep in freezing water, sleeping in canvas tents, and dying from diseases that had more to do with diet than dirt. Historians estimate that for every man who struck gold, 300 went home broke and malnourished. But the ones who lasted, the ones who survived, they ate these 30 foods. And some of them were more ingenious than anything on your grocery store shelf today. Before we start, hit that subscribe button because what you are about to hear might change how you think about the food in your own kitchen. Let us count down the 30 most rugged foods that kept gold rush miners alive. Number 30, parched corn. Before a miner even reached California, he needed something that would survive the 6-month overland journey without rotting, crumbling, or attracting vermin. Parched corn was the answer. Dried kernels roasted in a skillet until they darkened and cracked, then stored in cotton sacks that could ride in a saddlebag for weeks. A handful, chewed slowly, could hold off hunger for hours. The process was borrowed directly from Native American travelers who had used parched corn on long journeys for centuries. It weighed almost nothing, needed no water to prepare, and delivered enough calories to keep legs moving on the trail. Overlanders heading west on the Oregon and California trails in 1849 listed parched corn alongside ammunition as essential supplies. Children on wagon trains chewed it like candy. Teamsters rationed it when river crossings destroyed flour barrels. It was the original trail mix, centuries before anyone thought to add chocolate. Number 29, hardtack. That dense cracker, made from flour, water, and nothing else, became the foundation of the miner's diet. Baked until every trace of moisture vanished, a single piece could survive for years without spoiling. The Army had been issuing it since 1812. And miners heading west packed it by the barrel. The trick was knowing how to eat it. Straight from the sack, hardtack could crack a tooth. Miners soaked it in coffee or fried it in bacon grease, softening it into something almost edible. Some crumbled it into stews as a thickener. Others smashed it with a rifle butt and mixed the crumbs with water and sugar for a crude pudding. Worms were a common companion inside each cracker, especially after months on the trail. Veterans learned to eat hardtack in the dark, so they would not see what they were chewing. Number 28, salt pork. Every mining camp in the Sierras ran on salt pork. Slabs of fatty pig meat, packed in wooden barrels filled with brine, arrived by mule train from Sacramento. Miners sliced off chunks each morning to fry in cast iron pans over open fires. The grease that rendered out became cooking fat for everything else. Beans, cornbread, even coffee got a spoonful of pork drippings when supplies ran thin. A barrel of salt pork cost roughly $16 in 1850, a small fortune, but it lasted weeks and delivered the dense calories that swinging a pickaxe demanded. The taste was relentlessly salty, the texture somewhere between jerky and rubber. But no one complained because the alternative was nothing. Miners who could not afford salt pork ate whatever crawled past the campfire. Number 27, beans. If salt pork was the foundation, beans were the walls. Dried pinto beans, navy beans, and occasionally limas arrived in 100-pound sacks and became the single most consumed food in gold country. A miner could buy a pound for a few cents, soak them overnight in a tin pail, and boil them for hours over a low fire until they turned soft and thick. Some camps ate beans 3 meals a day, 7 days a week, for months straight. The protein kept men standing. The fiber kept things moving, and the smell of a bean pot bubbling over coals became the unofficial perfume of every tent city from Coloma to Sonora. Miners added whatever they had: salt pork, wild onions, and a pinch of chili pepper traded from Mexican miners who knew how to season food when nobody else did. Number 26. Sourdough bread. San Francisco still calls itself the sourdough capital for a reason. During the rush, miners discovered that wild yeast floating in the California air could be captured in a simple paste of flour and water. It was a living culture that could turn flour and water into risen bread without any store-bought yeast. The starter, kept warm in a jar tucked inside a shirt at night to prevent freezing, became more valuable than gold dust in some camps. Miners guarded their starters jealously. Some carried them for years across multiple claims. The bread itself was dense, tangy, and chewy, nothing like the airy loaves back east. But baked in a Dutch oven, buried in campfire coals, a fresh sourdough loaf was the closest thing to civilization a miner could taste. Old-timers who kept their starters alive became known as sourdoughs themselves, a badge of honor that meant you had survived at least one full winter in gold country. Number 25. Coffee. Not a food exactly, but no miner considered a meal complete without it, and many survived days on nothing else. Green coffee beans, shipped from Central America, arrived in burlap sacks, and miners roasted them in skillets over campfires, filling the mountain air with that dark, smoky scent. Ground with a rifle butt or a rock and boiled directly in a tin pot, Gold Rush coffee was black, bitter, and thick enough to chew. Men drank it at dawn before heading to the claim. They drank it at dusk when their backs screamed. They drank it in the middle of the night when dysentery kept them awake. By 1851, California was importing more coffee per capita than any other territory in America. It was fuel, medicine, and morale in a single tin cup. Number 24. Venison jerky. Deer roamed the Sierra foothills in enormous herds during the early rush years, and hunters supplied mining camps with fresh venison when they could. Fresh meat spoiled in hours during a California summer, so miners sliced it thin, salted it heavily, and hung it on lines strung between pine trees to dry in the mountain air. Properly dried jerky lasted months and weighed almost nothing, making it the ideal pocket food for men working claims miles from camp. Chewing a strip of jerky while panning for gold became such a common sight that illustrators back east drew it into nearly every sketch of mining life. The flavor was gamey, dense, and satisfying in a way that salt pork never managed. Number 23. Flapjacks. When a miner had flour, a bit of fat and water, he made flapjacks. Flat, thick, and cooked on a greased skillet until the edges blackened. These were not the fluffy pancakes of a Sunday breakfast. They were fuel, dense enough to carry in a pocket and tough enough to survive a day of rough handling. Miners ate them plain, rolled around strips of bacon, or drizzled with molasses when the supply wagon had been kind. Sourdough starter made them tangier and gave them a slight rise, but plenty were cooked flat as leather with nothing but flour and creek water. A man could make a dozen in 20 minutes and eat his way through them until sundown. This is the one that surprises everyone. Canned oysters were wildly popular in Gold Rush, California. They were shipped from the East Coast around Cape Horn, and tinned oysters arrived in San Francisco by the crate and became an unlikely luxury in mining camps. At $2 a tin in 1850, they were expensive, but miners, flush with a good day's panning, splurged on them as a celebration food. Eaten cold, straight from the can, fried in butter, or dumped into a stew, canned oysters offered a taste of the civilized world that most men had left behind. Saloons in Sacramento stacked empty oyster tins outside their doors like trophies. The shells that survived the journey were ground up and used to pave muddy streets. Number 21. Molasses. When sugar was too expensive and honey could not be found, molasses filled the gap. That thick, dark syrup arrived in barrels and went into everything. It was poured over flapjacks, stirred into beans for sweetness, mixed into cornbread batter, or eaten straight off a spoon when a man needed quick energy. A gallon of molasses cost less than refined sugar and lasted twice as long. Molasses also provided iron, something miners desperately needed when their diets ran short on fresh meat. The sticky residue clung to beards and shirt fronts, and the taste, bittersweet and earthy, became synonymous with camp life itself. Number 20. Bannock. Scottish and Irish miners brought this flatbread recipe across the Atlantic and straight into the gold fields. Flour, a pinch of salt, a bit of fat and water were mixed into a stiff dough, then baked on a hot stone beside the fire. It asked for nothing and forgave everything. Overwork it, undercook it, or burn one side, and it still fed you. In camps where ovens did not exist and Dutch ovens were shared among dozens, bannock was the bread of last resort. Some miners wrapped the dough around a green stick and held it over the flames, rotating slowly until the outside crisped. It tasted like survival, plain, dense, and reliable. Number 19. Vinegar pie. When fresh fruit was impossible to find, which was most of the year in a mountain mining camp, miners craved something, anything that tasted sweet and sharp. It answered that craving with nothing more than flour, sugar, butter, eggs, and a generous pour of apple cider vinegar. The vinegar mimicked the tartness of lemon or apple, and the result was a custard-style filling baked in a simple crust. It sounds terrible. It tasted surprisingly good. Boarding house cooks in Sacramento and Placerville served vinegar pie to men who had not tasted real fruit in months, and it became a genuine comfort food of the era. The recipe survived well into the 20th century in rural Appalachian and Midwestern kitchens, a direct descendant of gold rush desperation. Number 18. Dried apples. This is where the riots come in. Dried apples were shipped west by the ton because they traveled well, weighed little, and technically counted as fruit. The problem was that miners ate them constantly, reconstituted them in water, and cooked them into every dessert, sauce, and side dish the camp cook could imagine. After weeks of nothing but dried apple pie, dried apple sauce, and dried apple dumplings, the men reached a breaking point. Songs were written mocking the fruit. Poems circulated through camps with verses unprintable in polite company. In some camps, miners threatened cooks who served them one more dried apple dish. The hatred was real, loud, and widespread. Yet dried apples prevented scurvy when nothing else could. The vitamin C in even a reconstituted handful kept gums from bleeding and teeth from falling out. Miners cursed the fruit that was saving their lives. Number 17. Son of a gun stew. When a calf was slaughtered in camp, nothing was wasted. Heart, liver, kidneys, tongue, marrow, gut, and sweetbreads all went into a single iron pot with onions and whatever else could be found. Son of a gun stew, named with considerably rougher language in actual camps, was the original nose-to-tail cooking. The combination of organ meats created a broth so rich and mineral-dense that it bordered on medicinal. Trail bosses and camp foremen swore it could cure sickness, restore strength, and settle disputes, though the last claim was never verified. The stew simmered for hours, the smell drawing every hungry man in camp toward the fire. Those who could get past the idea of eating brain and intestine discovered something genuinely delicious. Those who could not went hungry. Number 16. Bear meat. Grizzlies and black bears roamed the Sierras in numbers that would stagger modern hikers, and miners hunted them for food as much as for safety. Bear meat was fat, strong-flavored, and calorie-dense, exactly what a man burning 5,000 calories a day needed. The fat rendered into grease for cooking and for waterproofing boots. The hide made blankets. Steaks were cut thick, salted, and fried in their own fat until the outside charred. Bear meat tasted like pork crossed with venison, rich and wild. Hunters who brought a bear into camp were treated like heroes. The meat was shared, the fat was divided, and the bones were boiled for broth. By the late 1850s, overhunting had thinned the grizzly population dramatically, and bear meat became rare. But for the early arrivals, it was one of the richest foods the wilderness could offer. Number 15. Cornmeal mush. A pot of cornmeal mush required nothing but ground corn and boiling water. Stirred over a low fire until thick, it became a porridge that could be eaten hot for breakfast, allowed to set firm, and sliced for frying later, or thinned with water into a gruel that went down easy when sickness struck. Cornmeal was cheaper than wheat flour and nearly as versatile. Miners from the American South already knew how to stretch a sack of cornmeal into a week's worth of meals, and they taught everyone else in camp. Fried mush, sliced golden and crispy from the skillet, topped with molasses, was considered a genuine treat. The simplicity was the point. When you have one ingredient and one pot, you learn to make it work. Number 14. Pemmican. Native American in origin and adopted by mountain men long before the gold rush, pemmican was the original energy bar. Dried meat pounded into powder mixed with rendered fat, and sometimes studded with dried berries, then pressed into dense cakes that could last years without spoiling. Fur trappers carried it across the Rockies. Miners heading to remote claims packed it when nothing else would survive the journey. A fist-sized portion delivered enough calories and protein to sustain a man through a full day of hard labor. The taste was rich, fatty, and concentrated, an acquired flavor that grew on you or did not. But nobody argued with the results. Pemmican kept men alive when the supply trains did not arrive. Number 13. Chili. Mexican miners working claims alongside Americans brought dried chili peppers, cumin, and garlic into camps where seasoning meant salt and nothing else. They cooked slow pots of meat and chili that transformed bland provisions into something with actual flavor. American miners tasted it once and never went back to plain boiled beef. By the early 1850s, chili stands operated in every major mining town, run by women known as chili queens, who ladled out bowls of fiery stew for a few cents apiece. The dish spread north from the Mexican mining camps and embedded itself into American cooking permanently. Every pot of chili simmering in a modern kitchen traces a direct line back to the goldfields. Number 12. Sourdough biscuits. When a miner did not have time, or did not have a Dutch oven for a proper loaf, he pulled a lump of sourdough starter, mixed it with flour, salt, and a bit of lard, and patted out biscuits to bake in a skillet with a tin plate for a lid. They came out golden, slightly sour, and tender enough to sop up bean broth or bacon grease. Faster than bread, and more satisfying than flapjacks, sourdough biscuits became the daily bread of the late rush years. A good camp cook could turn them out by the dozen while managing 3 other pots over the same fire. Number 11. Wild game birds. Quail, grouse, and wild pigeons filled the skies of gold country, and miners with decent aim ate well because of it. A single shotgun blast into a flock could bring down enough birds for the whole camp. Plucked, gutted, and roasted on a spit over open coals, wild birds offered lean protein and a flavor that broke the monotony of salt pork and beans. Miners who hunted contributed to the communal pot, and a roasted quail supper earned a man goodwill that lasted weeks. Number 10. Saleratus biscuits. Before baking powder was widely available, miners used saleratus. It was a crude form of baking soda harvested from dry lake beds in Nevada and the Great Basin. Mixed into biscuit dough, it produced a chemical rise that made bread possible without yeast or sourdough starter. The taste was slightly metallic, and too much saleratus turned biscuits yellow and bitter. But used carefully, it created a light, quick bread that could be made in minutes. Miners crossing the Nevada desert literally scraped their leavening agent off the ground. Number 9. Hangtown Fry. Legend says a miner struck it rich in Placerville, walked into the nearest hotel, and demanded the most expensive dish they could make. The cook combined eggs, bacon, and fried oysters, the 3 priciest ingredients in town, into a scramble that became Hangtown Fry. Whether the story is true matters less than the dish itself, which became a genuine Gold Rush classic. Rich, indulgent, and absurdly expensive by camp standards, it was the meal miners dreamed about while eating beans for the 47th consecutive night. Number 8. Hardtack and coffee stew. Called skilly-gilly by veterans of the Mexican War who carried the recipe into the goldfields, this was hardtack crumbled into boiling coffee, sweetened with sugar or molasses, and sometimes enriched with a spoonful of bacon grease. The coffee softened the crackers into something approaching porridge. The fat gave it body. The sugar made it tolerable. It was breakfast, lunch, and sometimes dinner for men too tired or too poor to cook anything more ambitious. Skilly-gally tasted exactly as miserable as it sounds, and miners ate it gratefully. Number 7. Citrus fruit. When ships carrying oranges and lemons docked in San Francisco, the fruit sold out in hours at prices that would make a modern grocery shopper faint. A single orange fetched up to $5 in 1849. Lemons went for more. The reason was not taste. It was scurvy. Miners bleeding from the gums, losing teeth, covered in bruises that would not heal, learned fast that citrus reversed the symptoms in days. Camp doctors, the few who existed, prescribed lemon juice and orange peel with an urgency that bordered on desperation. The vitamin C in a single piece of fruit could mean the difference between working a claim and dying in a tent. Citrus saved more miners than any medicine shipped from the East, and the men who could afford it survived, while others did not. Number 6. Bacon. Not the crispy strips of a modern breakfast, but thick slabs of smoked, salt-cured pork belly that arrived in wooden crates and hung from tent poles to keep it off the ground. Miners sliced it thick, fried it slow, and saved every drop of rendered fat for cooking. Bacon grease went into beans, biscuits, flapjacks, and cornbread. It waterproofed boots, and it greased axles on carts. A pound of bacon in 1850 cost roughly $1, steep by Eastern standards, but essential in the mountains. The smoky, salty flavor cut through the blandness of everything else, and a camp that had bacon was a camp with morale. Chinese miners arriving in California by the thousands brought rice, soy sauce, and dried vegetables that baffled American prospectors at first, then quietly converted many of them. Rice cooked faster than beans, stretched further than flour, and paired with anything. Chinese camp cooks demonstrated techniques that American miners had never seen, stir-frying rice with scraps of meat and wild greens in woks over roaring fires. By the mid-1850s, rice had become a staple in camps far beyond the Chinese claims. It was cheap, light, and nearly impossible to ruin. Qualities that made it indispensable when the cook was a 20-year-old farmer from Ohio who had never prepared a meal before leaving home. Number 4. Sourdough starter as a survival tool. This deserves its own entry beyond the bread it made. Miners discovered that active sourdough starter, the bubbling jar of wild yeast and flour, had uses beyond baking. Mixed with water, it could be consumed as a crude probiotic drink, one that settled stomachs ravaged by bad water and worse food. The fermentation process created B vitamins that supplemented diets dangerously low in nutrition. Some miners drank a spoonful of starter each morning like medicine. Others used it as a poultice on minor wounds, trusting the acidic paste to help prevent infection. Whether the science held up mattered less than the fact that miners who maintained their starters stayed healthier than those who did not. Number 3. Elk and deer tallow candles eaten as food. When provisions ran out completely, and they did regularly, miners ate their own candles. Tallow candles were made from rendered animal fat, and in a starvation situation that fat contained enough calories to keep a body functioning. Miners shaved tallow into boiling water to make a crude broth. They fried slices of candle in a pan like salt pork. They gnawed them raw when the fire went out. This was not resourcefulness. This was desperation. But the men who survived the worst supply shortages, the ones trapped by early snowfall in mountain camps, often credited tallow candles with keeping them alive long enough for the mule trains to arrive. Number 2. Boiled boot leather. This one sounds like myth. It is not. Miners trapped in the Sierra Nevada during brutal winters, when snow piled 15 feet high and supply routes closed for months, boiled their own boots, belts, and leather saddlebags to extract whatever nutrition the hide could offer. The collagen in leather, when boiled long enough, created a thin, gelatinous broth that provided minimal calories and the psychological comfort of having something warm in the stomach. Journals from the Donner Party and later mining expeditions describe the process in plain, matter-of-fact language. You boiled your boots. You drank the water. You did not complain, because complaining required energy you did not have. Number 1. Flour straight. When everything else was gone, when the beans ran out, the salt pork barrel stood empty, the bacon was a memory, and the nearest supply town was a week's ride through hostile territory. Miners ate raw flour. They mixed it with creek water into a paste and swallowed it. They stirred it into a thin gruel over the last coals of a dying fire. Sometimes they just poured it dry into their mouths and chased it with water. It delivered nothing but starch and calories, but in the goldfields, that was enough to survive another day. Flour was the last line between a miner and survival, and the men who lived to tell their stories often ended them the same way. We ate the flour. Plain flour and water, and we were grateful. That gratitude, born in the most desperate circumstances imaginable, defined the gold rush more than any nugget ever pulled from a river. These 30 foods tell the real story of the gold rush, not the romantic tale of lucky strikes and instant fortunes, but the brutal truth of men who ate candle wax, boiled their boots, and fought over dried apples just to see another sunrise. The next time you open your refrigerator and complain there is nothing to eat, remember the miner standing in a frozen creek, chewing hardtack full of worms, dreaming of a single orange he could not afford. That is the Wild West they do not put in the movies.